Hello everyone, can everybody hear me? Looks like we're good. Hello, hello, and welcome to Bible Study for Everybody, which is kind of a offshoot of the God Loves Gays series, mostly because I figured not everybody likes the deep dive into the Bible stuff. It's a little different than the general histories we do in the other series, but they're connected. So, gotta make this kind of a side series that is gonna walk through the entire Bible in incredible detail and discuss what it means, what it was intended to mean at the time, you know, what inspired it, the writing styles, the history, all of it. Hello, Ghost Riot, Natasha, Labsol, Zaka, thank you for joining me. I do know it's a holiday, so I don't know how many people we'll have, but I ain't doing nothing, so if you want to hang out and listen to some Bible study for a while, welcome and thank you for joining us. So we are starting with the very beginning of the book, Genesis, or as it is known in the Hebrew, Bereshit. I think I am pronouncing that correctly, but feel free to correct me if I'm not. For the first thing we have to cover, which we've mentioned in previous discussions, the Bible was probably originally an oral tradition. Originally, it was likely first written down when the Jewish people had a kingdom, when it became less of a wandering tribe of people and more of a community living under a king who needed documents and histories of their heroes to encourage patriotism, that kind of thing. Specifically, the book of Genesis, as it's known in the Christian tradition. The name comes from Biblos Genesios. This is the book of the origin of the Greek. In Jewish tradition, Bereshit, it means in the beginning of. And it was tradition back then that you would name a book based on, the first sentence, the first words. So in both Genesis, Bereshit, basically that's the first words that came in the book. Genesis is the Greek, Bereshit is the Jewish. Genesis is the first of 5 books that are called the Torah in Judaism and the books of Moses in Christianity. We'll talk about why. It consists of what's called the primeval narratives and the stories of Israel's ancestors. Primeval narratives being ancient mythological history. Before, the time before time. Where did we come from and who made us and why? And then the Israel's ancestors are ancient Jewish history of the first tribes of Israel. It was written to be read aloud. Even up until way past Jesus and his time, books were still written and intended to be read to a crowd. Most people couldn't read. You'd go to church or you'd go to seminary or you'd go to school and the books would be read aloud. And so the Bible itself was written with a style that was meant to be enjoyed by ear. And it had a lot of poetry in it. Hebrew poetry tends to be focused less on rhyme and more on what's called parallelism, repetitive thoughts, which you'll see when we read it. We're going to be reading from Everett Fox's translation, which tries to recover the poetry and the audio narrative, the focus on having it read to you rather than reading it by yourself. And it is very different when compared to the traditional translation. So, who wrote the book of Genesis? Tradition says Moses wrote the book of Genesis. That's not actually something that the Bible says. The first mention of the idea comes from a book called Jubilees from the Dead Sea Scrolls from the 2nd century. It was Martin Luther who actually appended the phrase, the first book of Moses, to Genesis, and in most Bibles, that's what you'll see, the first book of Moses, blah, blah, blah. Tradition being that all 5 books were divine revelation, which was said to Moses by God, and then Moses wrote it down. And you can see how that would lead to some issues where people would say, well, obviously it's the direct word of God. It's all written at the same time by one person. It immediately presents an idea of uniformity that isn't in the text. It presents the idea that it was written at one specific moment in history, directly from the ear, from hearing God. And so that makes all of it, God's exact words. And you still see that idea present, especially in the American South, where it's the literal divine revelation of God. It's not. We have historical proof that it was, in fact, written over several centuries by multiple people with multiple history and ideas and reasons for writing what they are writing about God. But we'll talk about that. Hello, Jeff and Alexis. Welcome. It's called the documentary hypothesis, an idea that started a couple centuries ago. A bunch of different authors and writers and researchers basically contributing to the idea that the books of the Bible were written by different people. Specifically, the first 5 books that everybody always said were written by Moses. We know lots of the later books are written by, various authors, but they started chipping away at the idea that Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus were written by one person. How do we know? There's different ways, different names for God being used, different focus on the type of writing. Like one guy likes hero stories, one guy keeps writing genealogies. They use different story archetypes, different words. There's a lot of really intense scholarship that goes into the theories of the different writers. At one point, there was an idea that there were 4 writers: the Yahwist, the Elahist, the Deuteronomist, and the priest. That's what I was taught in college. Since then, I think they've kind of decided that there was 3. There's still a lot of discussion going on with this idea. The general agreement is there was more than one writer, but who wrote what and how many were there and how was it gathered together is still being debated today. One of the major theories is the fact that in a certain period of Jewish history, the country of Israel split into 2, Judah and Israel. Both of them had their own monarchies and their own histories and wrote their own books of their nation's heroes. And at some point, later on, what we call the priestly writer, around the time of the Babylonian exile, took both of these documents from the north and south of Israel, kind of edited them and put them together in a coherent form, and then added new things that had to do with the priest class, like Numbers and Leviticus. And around that time, which would be like 500 BCE, 450 BCE, when the exile in Babylon ends and they return home, what we would call the Bible exists. You know, the bare bones of the Bible. Because at this point, the editors had kind of pulled together all the various documents we recognize as the Bible. Well, the Hebrew. Obviously, the later books don't exist. Jesus ain't around yet. It exists at this point. So we probably at least have 3 writers at the least, or schools of writers, where you had the historians of southern Israel, Judah, the historians from the north, writing their own documents. Eventually, an editor is going to pull all these things together. They're going to add some of their rituals, some of the laws. You can see here some of the various things that kind of get pulled together, oral tradition written down, all to come together to make this document that has multiple stories in it. And it has multiple writers. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the fact that we know there's multiple writers, and we have proof, is the fact that multiple stories in the Bible are told twice. One of which is the creation myth. There's 2 creation myths in the Bible, and they were both kept on purpose, and they were both written by different people. There's the creation myth in which God creates the world in 7 days, and then there's the creation myth that involves the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve, and they both happen back to back, right away. So it's very on purpose that both these contradicting stories of the creation exist next to each other, were put there on purpose. There's no way the author or the editor could have missed the fact that these stories exist side by side and contradict each other, but they kept them both, and they didn't edit them to match each other. And so that tells us, 1, 2 different authors, 2 different reasons for these stories to exist, and they both mattered to the people of the time. We'll go into real deep detail and actually read both. But first, let's talk about some of the Hebrew creation stories that don't exist in Genesis, because there are some. Let's see here. Oh, wrong. Me? Oh, did I put that image in twice, maybe? What? Excuse me, I have to fix my images. Apparently, I missed some. Where are you, images? Here we go. That one's there. Here we go. That's the wrong order, stupid. Why are you like this? Ugh. How's everybody doing today? I'm all out of sorts, apparently. Alright, let's add image 5. And 6. Come on, you. Oh, that's not the one I need, but I guess that works. And 7. There we go. So, as we've said, the book of the Bible is collected from a lot of different sources over time, a lot of different writers, and so they kept things that contradict each other. The creation myth is told in Genesis twice, but there's also mentions of a creation story in other parts of the Bible, like Psalm 74, which says that God split open the sea and broke the heads of the monster in the waters, crushed the Leviathan, and gave it as food to the creatures of the desert. This is really similar to the creation myths that existed in Babylon and older countries around that era. Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, those stories of creation centered upon a god who fought against the primal goddess of the waters, Tiamat in some stories, Mamu Tiawath. She had a lot of different names, but essentially, God kills a dragon over the sea and creates the world from her corpse. That sounds a lot like it. So does another psalm that mentions, he creates, he stretches out the heavens, creates the beams of his upper chambers on the waters, which also kind of references a Babylonian myth of a god who creates his chambers, Apsu, out of the corpse of his dead dad. Again, kind of pulling on Babylonian stories and symbolism in their poetry, essentially. The Psalms are very poetic. They're meant to be read aloud. But they contradict with the earlier creation stories that we are going to read. And again, these people, they didn't really, edit and change these things to all match and be coherent. All these stories had value. They all contradicted, but that's because they weren't meant as literal truth. They were spiritual histories. There were a couple other places in the Bible, which we won't actually read through, but there's a mention in Job 38 that mentions, Yahweh laying the foundations. Job 26 mentions Rahab, which is another of the chaos dragons that God destroys. Every mythology back then had a dragon of chaos that got destroyed by God. Isaiah 27 actually puts it into, future stories where he says Yahweh will punish the Leviathan and slay the dragon that is in the sea as part of his foretelling of the future. Again, the story of God killing a dragon. Now, let's actually talk about the two creation myths that exist in Genesis. Let's see here. That is another lovely image from William Blake. But we're not actually going to read Eve first, of course. We're going to read them in order. And again, this is Everett Fox's translation, meant to be read aloud. He kind of tries to recreate the poetry and the rhythm of the original Hebrew in English. Is that Gandalf? Is there a cat crying? Let me check on cat. Kitty! Where is Kitty? Oh, why are you... Okay, bye. He was in my closet. I've been cleaning, and I moved their litter box out of the closet so I could vacuum, and I guess he was in there crying, looking for it, because he was like, I don't know where it went. So I had to let him out. All right, here we go. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth had been wild and waste, darkness over the face of ocean, breath of God hovering over the face of the waters. God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw the light, that it was good. God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was evening, there was morning, one day. God said, let there be a dome amid the waters. Let it separate waters from waters. God made the dome and separated the waters that were below the dome from the waters that were above the dome. It was so. God called the dome heaven. There was evening, there was morning, second day. God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered to one place, and let the dry land be seen. It was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. God saw that it was good. God said, let the earth sprout forth with sprouting growth, plants that seed forth seeds, fruit trees that yield fruit, after their kind in which is their seed upon the earth. It was so. The earth brought forth sprouting growth, plants that seed forth seeds after their kind, trees that yield fruit in which is their seed after their kind. God saw that it was good. There was evening, there was morning, third day. God said, let there be lights in the dome of the heavens to separate the day from the night, that they may be for signs, for set times, for days and years. Let them be for lights in the dome of the heavens, to provide light upon the earth. It was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light for ruling the day, and the smaller light for ruling the night, and the stars. God placed them in the dome of the heavens, to provide light upon the earth, to rule the day and the night, to separate the light from the darkness. God saw that it was good. There was evening, there was morning, fourth day. God said, "Let the waters swarm with a swarm of living beings, and let fowl fly above the earth, across the dome of the heavens." God created the great sea serpents, and all living beings that crawl about, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and all winged fowl after their kind. God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Bear fruit, and be many, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the fowl be many on earth." There was evening, there was morning, fifth day. God said, "Let the earth bring forth living beings after their kind, herd animals, crawling things, and the wild life of the earth after their kind." It was so. God made the wild life of the earth after their kind, and the herd animals after their kind, and all the crawling things of the soil after their kind. God saw that it was good. God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the heavens, animals, all the earth, and all crawling things that crawl upon the earth." God created humankind in his image. In the image of God did he create it. Male and female did he create them. God blessed them. God said to them, "Bear fruit and be many, and fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the heavens, and all living things that crawl about upon the earth." God said, "Here, I give you all plants that bear seeds that are upon the face of all the earth, and all trees in which there is tree fruit that bears seeds. For you shall they be, for eating. And also for all the living things of the earth, for all the fowl of the heavens, for all that crawls upon the earth in which there is living being, all green plants for eating." It was so. Now God saw all that he had made, and here, it was exceedingly good. There was evening, there was morning, the sixth day. Thus were finished the heavens and the earth with all of their array. God had finished on the seventh day his work that he had made, and then he ceased on the seventh day from all his work that he had made. God gave the seventh day his blessing, and he hallowed it, for on it he ceased from all his work that by creating God had made. So, very nice. I love that particular reading of how there's a lot of exclamation points, if you can't tell, a lot of repetition, which is, again, Hebrew poetry is very repetitive. Specifically, the section where God created human in his image, in the image of God he created it, male and female he created, tends to be indented because it was literal poetry. The reason for the repetition is that section was meant to be especially poetic. Bye, Ghost Riot. Thanks for joining us. Now, what does this mean? Where does it come from? Why is it here? We'll start with the fact that God creates everything very easily in this story. He wills it, and it's there, and it is good. There's no explanation for who God is, or where he came from, or what his parents, his name. The term used in this for God is Elohim, which is kind of like saying, if you were writing a story about a guy that was going and doing, like a hero who was going and doing things, and you called the hero, Hero. The hero defeated the dragon. Well, yeah, but what's his name? Who is he? It doesn't say. It just says Elohim. The God created the universe. Which God? Who? There's no personality. It's incredibly, unanthropomorphized, very inhuman, completely unlike us, even though we are made in his image. You see the repetition of there was evening, there was morning, it was another day. That was the way that the ancient Hebrews, and as far as I know, modern Hebrew people, see the day. Daytime ends like with the next morning. So evening is a new day. That's why it's phrased that way. You see that he makes essentially an ordered universe. Everything is very ordered. It's very easy. There is a lot of separation. Let us separate light from darkness. This is light and this is darkness. It is good. It is focused on the creation of animals and of plants, and, if you didn't catch it, on the idea that we should all live off of eating plants. Humankind is not allowed to eat meat at this point. It will be a lot of stories until God gives us permission to eat animals. At this point, we're all meant to be eating plants. There is no killing in this idea of the universe. In this version, male and female did he create them. He made them at the same time, and they are not in any way implied to be subordinate, either one or to the other. This account is probably written by a priest around the 6th century BCE, which is when we discussed the books of the Bible are all being gathered together and made into what we call the Bible now, which didn't really exist until this point. This story was probably written and appended to the books of the Bible then. In this version, God is completely benevolent, completely all-powerful, omniscient, transcendent, completely unlike any god that had existed at the time. Think about, Marduk, Bel, the great gods of the ancient world were all humanized in a sense. They had personalities, they had names, parents, histories, they came from somewhere, and they had flaws often. They were not seen as omniscient, they were not seen as all-powerful. They had to struggle to do anything. All of the great stories involved wars and struggles against other gods. This god does not struggle at all. There's no war, I have created the world, and it is good. It's so simple, and it focuses so heavily on just how easy it is for this god to just accomplish everything. Whereas other creation myths, as we'll see, it is nowhere near as easy. There's this heavy focus on separation, on boundaries, on the idea of this is this is that, let's define what it is, which is going to be interesting when we juxtapose it to the next creation story, where separation is not a good thing. In this creation story, by separating everything out, you create and define what they are, and they exist. Separation is part of creation, and it's a good thing. In the next story, separation is also part of creation, but it leads to the downfall of the creation. It was radically new, this story, at the time. There's no parents of this god. He's wholly omnipotent. He has a monopoly. There's no other gods here. I mean, he discusses things in a plural, and there's some interesting theories about why he talks in the plural, who is he talking to, but there's no other god mentioned. There's no other discussion of, the gods of the Hebrews at this period were also, we had this god, and also the god of war, and the god of... There's none of that. Up until this point, Israelites had worshipped other gods. Like, they had their god of their people, and then also they lived in Babylon, so they worshipped god of so-and-so and who and whatever, They didn't really become monotheists until the 600 era. I thought Moses wrote it. We discussed earlier, if you missed that, he did not write it. He did not, at all. This particular section, this very first creation story, is written by a priest in the 600s. Now, let's get to the next creation story. We'll talk a lot more about the histories and development of both, but let's read both first, and then we'll get to that. So, here's creation myth 2. Happens immediately after the first. These are the beginnings of the heavens and the earth, their being created. On that day Yahweh, God, made earth and heaven. No bush of the field was yet on earth, no plant of the field had yet sprung up. For Yahweh, God, had not made it rain upon earth, and there was no human to till the soil, but a surge would well up from the ground and water all the face of the soil. And Yahweh, God, formed the human of dust from the soil. He blew into his nostrils the rush of life, and the human became a living being. Understand, when it uses he pronouns, we don't have neutral pronouns, but the Adam at this point is neutral. It discussed as human because the word hadama is the general human term. It means humanity. And is only translated in English often as male because we don't have that, neuter concept in our language. Yahweh, God, planted a garden in Eden, in the east, and there he placed the human whom he'd formed. Yahweh, God, caused to spring up from the soil every type of tree, desirable to look at and good to eat, and the tree of life in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowing of good and evil. Now a river goes out from Eden to water the garden, and from there it divides and becomes 4 stream heads. The name of the first one is Pishon, that is, the one that circles through all the land of Havilah, where gold is. The gold of that land is good. There too are bdellium and the precious stone, carnelian. The name of the second river is Gihon, that is, the one that circles through all the land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris, that is, the one that goes to the east of Assyria. And the fourth river, that is Euphrates. Very interesting, very different compared to the first story where creation's just happening in the midst of nothing and nowhere. We're now in a physical, earthly place. Two of the rivers named here are real physical rivers on Earth from Mesopotamia, which, the Jewish people lived in and around at various points. The river Gihon that goes through the land of Cush. Cush is often used to refer to the Egyptian lands, so there's a lot of, history that believes probably that might be the Nile. We'll never be sure. There's a city in Sumer called Idinu or Idiru. That was a very ancient holy city, very important to the region, and kind of related to the word Eden, kind of close to the rivers, kind of thought of as possibly the history, the place that it was, named after. Like, when this person wrote this story, they were like, well, everybody knows of that city as a very holy and beautiful place. That's the city I'm going to use. If you want to know more about why it is definitely not written by Moses, long story short, the Bible itself doesn't say it. The Bible itself does not say it. Martin Luther said it and put it in his Bible, but the Bible itself does not say Moses wrote these books anywhere in it. So if you want to just go by the word of the Bible, you're wrong. Moses did not write these books. You can also just look at all the ancient history of the research into who wrote these books and the fact that it's just completely obvious multiple people wrote these books. Yahweh God took the human and set him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to watch it. Yahweh God commanded concerning the human, saying, From every other tree of the garden you may eat, yes, eat. But from the tree of the knowing of good and evil you are not to eat from it, for on the day that you eat from it you must die, yes, die. Now Yahweh God said, It is not good for the human to be alone. I will make him a helper corresponding to him. So Yahweh God formed from the soil every living thing of the field and every fowl of the heavens, and brought each to the human to see what he would call it. You already see multiple contradictions between the two stories. In the previous story, he creates different animals on different days. Birds are separated from the cattle and what have you. Here, he creates all the animals on the same day after he makes man, even though the first story says men come last. We'll discuss why these stories differ and what the two authors were trying to say and why they both are in here after we've read the whole thing. The human called out names for every herd animal and for the fowl of the heavens and for every living thing of the field. But for the human there could be found no helper corresponding to him. So Yahweh God caused a deep slumber to fall upon the human so that he slept. He took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh in its place. Yahweh God built the rib that he had taken from the human into a woman and brought her to the human. The human said, This time she is it, bone from my bones, flesh from my flesh. She shall be called woman, for from man she was taken. Therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. Now the two of them, the human and his wife, were nude, yet they were not ashamed. Now the snake was more shrewd than all the living things of the field that Yahweh God had made. It said to the woman, even though God said, You are not to eat from any of the trees in the garden. The woman said to the snake, From the fruit of the other trees in the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden God has said, You are not to eat from it, and not to touch it, lest you die. The snake said to the woman, Die, you will not die. Rather, God knows that on the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will become like gods, knowing good and evil. The woman saw that the tree was good for eating, that it was a delight to the eyes, and the tree was desirable to contemplate. She took from its fruit and ate, and gave also to her husband beside her, and he ate. Buddy. Oh my goodness, just block him for me, Jeff. You're not listening to a person that for 7 years studied this in college and also studied this off college and has learned a lot, and you're basically just saying the author is anonymous and not identified as a priest either. We know he wasn't literally a priest. We call him the priestly writer because he probably was from the priestly class, because his style of writing matches known priests from the time. If you open your mind and listen and think about possibly learning these things, you might learn something rather than closing your mind and deciding you have to be right because it makes you uncomfortable to consider you could be wrong. Let's see here. The eyes of the two of them were opened, and they knew then that they were nude. They sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. Now they heard the sound of Yahweh. They heard Yahweh. Interesting thing to remember. God, who was walking about in the garden at the breezy time of the day. And the human and his wife hid themselves from the face of Yahweh God amid the trees of the garden. Yahweh God called to the human and said to him, "Where are you?" He said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I am nude, so I hid myself." He said, "Who told you that you are nude? From the tree about which I commanded you not to eat, have you eaten?" The human said, "The woman whom you gave to be beside me, she gave me from the tree, so I ate." Yahweh God said to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" The woman said, "The snake enticed me, so I ate." Yahweh God said to the snake, "Because you have done this, cursed be you from all the animals and from all the living things of the field. Upon your belly shall you walk, and dust shall you eat all the days of your life. I put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. They will bruise you on the head, you will bruise them in the heel." To the woman he said, "I will multiply your pain, your pregnancy. With pains shall you bear children. Toward your husband will be your lust, yet he will rule over you." To Adam he said, "Because you have hearkened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, 'You are not to eat from it,' cursed be the soil on your account. With painstaking labor shall you eat from it all the days of your life. Thorn and string shrub, let it spring up for you, when you seek to eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread, until you return to the soil, for from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust shall you return." The human called his wife's name Life-Giver, for she became the mother of all the living. Now Yahweh God made Adam and his wife coats of skin and clothed them. Notice that's the first time either of them have been named. Up until this point, they were the human and his wife. Now that they have disobeyed and become like God, they have names. Yahweh God said, "Here the human has become like one of us, in knowing good and evil. So now lest he send forth his hand, and take also from the tree of life, and eat, and live throughout the ages." So Yahweh God sent him away from the Garden of Eden, to work the soil from which he had been taken. He drove the human out, and caused to dwell eastward of the Garden of Eden the winged sphinxes and the flashing, ever-turning sword, to watch over the way to the tree of life. Winged sphinxes is the translation this author uses because the original term in Hebrew has a very specific connotation to us now, cherubim. The angels are who he places before it, but winged sphinxes is probably truer to how they imagined them at the era. It's interesting. He doesn't use cherubim because he doesn't want people imagining like little cute babies. But anyway. Very different stories. Incredibly different. There's some interesting things to discuss about why they're different and why they're both here. In the creation story in Eden, it starts with the world existing, but there's no life in it. In the other story, he creates the world from nothing, and then he starts to fill it with life and with animals. In this one, there's a world, but it's a desert, and he had not caused it to rain. And then suddenly a mist, the word is in Hebrew is best translated as mist, though often it's translated to be like a fountain from underground, rises and fertilizes the earth. And so then they can actually work on, growing things in the world. It's an interesting idea that essentially this first mythical irrigation happens because in Palestine, in the area that the Israelites lived, they had to rely on rain. They couldn't have irrigation systems. They didn't have rivers the way that Mesopotamia and Egypt did. He creates Adam from the earth and breathes life into his nostrils. It doesn't say in the first story what he makes the humans from. And he creates them at the same time in the first one, not in the second. We have a far more physical place. Eden possibly comes from the Akkadian word Edenu, which means plain or steppe. And Eridu is the ancient city that was incredibly holy in Sumer. I did write that down. Eridu is the other possible relation, but probably not. We don't know. Now, he creates Eve. He takes a rib and builds a woman. Interesting thing, the Hebrew word for rib means both a rib like the bone and a side like a side of something. So he takes the woman's side out of Adam and makes a woman, and then Adam becomes a man, which is really fascinating, and comes into Jewish tradition that says essentially that the first person was like a neuter being, both male and female. He names her Hawa, which is Eve, which is a word that basically means life or life giver, as this translation says. And it's only after, they eat of the tree that they are referred to in gendered terms. The word where he says the human needs a helper, the word is izer, which is translated often as helper or helpmate, but can also mean strength or power. That he looks for a helpmate that is fit for him or equal to him. The word is kenegdo. It only appears here in the Bible, and it means neged means equal. So essentially, the human needs someone that is powerful and equal to him, someone that can work with him, which is very different compared to the ending. The snake arrives, which is interesting. The word that describes the snake is often crafty, is often the translation. Where does it say here? And soon after, it says the snake is crafty. Let's see where I put this. The snake... here it says was more shrewd. Often it's translated as crafty. The snake appears and speaks to them, and it says that they were naked. And the reason for the repetition of reminding us that they're naked at this point, in Hebrew, the word crafty is arum. The word naked is arumim. Repetition of similar words is a major part of poetry in Hebrew, and it immediately associates the humans with the snake. They have something in common for some reason. Why a snake of all the animals? Well, for one, we have to question why suddenly is there this evil being in the garden when God made everything, and where did the snake come from, and why is it evil? In the ancient traditions, snakes and dragons were always the source of chaos. Tiamat, as we mentioned in the Babylonian and Sumer traditions. Apep was a giant snake in Egyptian tradition that came from evil and chaos. Snakes were often associated with not necessarily evil so much as primordial chaos. And it was also the symbol of wisdom. It was the god Ea or Enki. It was his animal, and he was the god of wisdom, very popular god at the time. And the snake appears and tells them, well, they say, God told us not to eat that tree because when we do, we'll die. And the snake says, no, you won't. You'll be like God. You'll know good and evil. And the snake's right. The snake's not lying. Snake didn't trick him. It told him the exact truth. And then she looked at the tree and she was like, you know what? Seems cool. Maybe I should eat it. Also notice that the whole time, Adam is next to her. Eve is the one having this conversation and making this decision, but Adam's there. He could say something, do something, and he doesn't. The most popular kind of academic idea here is that Eve represents something in us. She came from Adam, so she's a part of Adam. So she represents some kind of instinctual part of us, that curiosity, that desire for experience, that wants to be like God, the desire for knowledge. Now remember that God said, when you eat of the tree, you must die. Yes, die. They don't die when they eat from the tree, but it says you must die. They end up leaving the garden and eventually they are mortal. There's something about knowledge of good and evil, something about the fact that they have become, they've lost their innocence. That means that they're going to die. What they learn of is the knowledge of death, that they have to die one day. And that is what's taken the innocence from them. God isn't saying that the tree is going to kill you. He's saying if you eat that tree, you're going to know about death and things are going to change. They're not going to be the same anymore. As soon as they eat, they realize they're naked. They become ashamed. They clothe each other. They recognize that they're different. Remember how the first story was about creation from separation? So is this one. God separates out Adam and creates him, and then separates Eve from him and creates her. But even though they are separate, they are the same. They are treating each other as equals. They don't recognize any differences between each other. They're not ashamed of their nakedness. Once they eat of the fruit, they're ashamed. They recognize that they're different. They recognize they are separate, and something is broken. When God appears and walks through the garden, which is a very different anthropomorphic version of God compared to the first version of this story. Another proof that these are two different authors. The first God would never have said that God walks like a human. This one does. He says, hey, what's going on? What's up? And Adam blames his wife. And Eve blames the snake. And neither of them takes responsibility for the fact that they chose to eat the apple. Or, well, the fruit is not named in this. Probably it was a pomegranate, given the era and the ideas about fruit, but nowadays everybody imagines it's an apple. Neither of them takes responsibility. How much of the punishment they receive is about the fact they broke the law, and more about the fact that they didn't own up to it? They now are mature in the sense that they recognize death, which a major part of growing up is recognizing that death is a reality that we all must face. And they broke the rules and they won't even admit to it. And they blame each other. Remember separation? Now they recognize they are separate, different people, and they're turning on each other. Their community is broken. Their bond has broken. Everything has changed. And so God curses them. This whole time they've lived in this fertile garden where they haven't had to struggle for food or anything. Now they're going to have to struggle for food for the rest of their life. There's an interesting translation discussion here where it says a woman will suffer the pangs of childbirth. It's possible that that's not actually the best translation. There's an author that argues that this section, it represents parallel poetry. One line will match another. 1 and 2, 3 and 4 the lines will kind of tie together. And the word that ties together best in this version is not pregnancy, it's conception. I will multiply your conceptions, not your pregnancy. There's this section here where two nouns linked by a conjunction modify each other in Hebrew. It's called a hendiadis. And so if you consider that, when basically, a long story short, the translator believes it's better for this section to say that she will have a lot more work and conceptions, more pregnancies. Instead of saying you will have more pain, you will suffer pain when you bear children, it's more correct to say you're going to be pregnant all the time. And now what's the why is that important as a difference? There's very traditional Christian folks who try to argue that, like, the suffering of physical pain is the lot of womanhood because of the garden, and that women should suffer physical pain from pregnancy, from periods. Like, you shouldn't be able to take birth control, you shouldn't be able to get blah, 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 blah. It makes a lot more sense that conception is the word here, because this is a story that, unlike the first story, explains the state of the world. Why is the world the way it is now? And the world they lived in was a desert land that was very hard to survive in. And pregnancy, having children, was a major, major import. We discussed in other videos that living in a desert where life was so hard and people died all the time, you had to have as many kids as possible to ensure that life went on. And so he's saying here, to survive in the desert, you're going to have a lot of kids. You know, you're going to have to be getting pregnant all the time. And he says, towards your husband will be your lust, he will rule over you, meaning essentially, you can try and abstain and not try to have kids, but you're going to get horny, and then your husband is going to have sex with you and you're going to get pregnant. You know, it's explaining the situation of life at the time of writing. The husband will have to work the field, and it will be a struggle, and it will be hard to get plants because they live in the frickin' desert. They rely on luck and rain to be able to survive. It's very, very hard. And so you see here in this story an explanation for the world they lived in. The word they use for God is Yahweh, which you see, it would say Yahweh, God said to blah, blah, blah. In the first story, we said the word they used in Hebrew was Elohim. Yahweh is a far more personal God. Yahweh was the name of a god in a pantheon millennia back. Millennia. And so this is a different writer who sees God as a personified God. A person that walks and has feelings, gets angry, curses. The first God doesn't do that. The first God is completely impersonal, inhuman, completely incomprehensible to humanity. This God is a God that walks and talks with people. It's a different kind of presentation of God. It was likely written around the 10th century. In that era, Judaism was in the height of the era of kings, the very first Israelite dynasties, Solomon, David. it was written around that time. And so this was a writer looking at the world they lived in which everybody was struggling to survive in a desert, in which women were subordinated to their husbands per Hebrew tradition of the time, and was trying to explain it and explain why the world is the way it is. So many myths of the ancient world were meant as explaining why the world looks the way it does. Why is the ocean like this? Why is the sky like this? Why is society like this? That's what this story is. Very different from the very first story, which doesn't explain really any. It gives a creation myth of where the world came from, but it is far more of a kind of trying to say something about the world. Rather, this is trying to explain something about the world. And it's descriptive, not prescriptive. People like to say that, in the ancient, many centuries later, Christians would take this and say, this is an explanation for why humans are all evil and women are bad and we should punish them. That's saying it's prescriptive, like, because this happened, we must do this. No, the writer of the time was just describing the world, trying to understand their world, give an explanation for why things the way they were the way they were at the time. They weren't saying they had to stay that way. And in fact, the word for sin doesn't appear anywhere in this story. That is not the focus of this story. But obviously, there's a lot of different versions, different things in both stories that don't match up. So why are they both here? And what do they mean? To discuss that, let's discuss the myths of the era. One of which is the 7 Tablets of Creation, or Enuma Elish, a Babylonian creation story. Let me go back. I lost my spot. At various points in Jewish history, they lived and interacted very heavily with the people of Mesopotamia, which involves multiple cultures. Sumer was the oldest, Sumerians. They eventually kind of fuse with a group called the Akkadians, and then the Assyrians show up, and then the Babylonians show up. Long story short, there was a lot of other cultures they were interacting with, and at certain points were conquered by. Assyria conquers Israel at some points. Babylon eventually invades and conquers them. Egypt's involved. I mean, we know that. They're mentioned in the Bible a lot. So they are interacting with and even living with these people at various points. In the exile in the 500s, the Jewish people are all taken to Babylon and live there for about 70 years. So the myths and the traditions of these cultures are baked into Judaism. Until the 600s, they were even worshiping Babylonian gods alongside their god Yahweh, who was seen as part of a pantheon, essentially. Monotheism wasn't going to become a major aspect of Israel tradition until the 600s. The sources of these stories, well, let's first discuss the very first line of Genesis of the Bible. Let's see here. There we go. The earth had been wild and waste, darkness over the face of ocean, breath of God hovering over the face of the waters. The traditional translation says the surface of the deep. The word that's translated as deep is tehom. Tehom is a word that in Hebrew means deep. It's a derivative of a word that means, a derivative of hum, which means to roar or rage. It indicates the roaring deep sea. It specifically is a word that was used to refer to the goddess Tiamat, who in Mesopotamian tradition was the goddess of the chaotic sea. All life came out of Tiamat, the chaotic sea, and she was eventually defeated by the god Marduk or the god Ashur, depends on who's telling the story, and from her corpse the world was made. The face of the deep. Essentially, God is hovering over the Chaos Sea, Tiamat. It's a story, it's a line that directly comes from these other myths. And remember, this was written in the 6th century when the Jewish people were living in Babylon. The spirit of God, or the wind of God, the breath of God, is hovering over the waters. The word for hovering implies kind of imagine like a bird hovering in the air above the surface. Multiple different traditions refer to the creation of the world involving winds or breath. In Egypt, There was darkness on the abyss, and the waters were moved by the wind, and that created existence. Very similar. In Mesopotamia, Merodach or Bel or Marduk is the most recent translation, I think, defeats the dragon Tiamat using the power of the four winds. That is how he rips her in half. So there's this heavy association in the old world with a chaotic sea of an endless dark sea of chaos, and the use of the winds to overcome that sea, and from it creating the world. Now, in the first story, God creates the world in 7 days. It's very interesting that he does that. At this time, the Hebrew people were living in Babylon, and Babylon, the New Year festival was like the biggest shindig of all. It was when they celebrated the creation of the world, the Enuma Elish. They would read the Enuma Elish aloud over a course of a couple of days, like a week, and celebrate Marduk's triumph over Tiamat and the creation of everything. The Hebrew festival of the New Year was 7 days long. And it's very obvious, as we've read the version of this story that's very, like, read aloudable, that this was read and intended to be read aloud. And it was written by a priest and appended to the Bible at this point in history when they're living in Babylon, where this festival of the New Year is so important. How likely is it that the story of the first creation involving 7 days was written for the purpose of being involved in a New Year's festival, to mirror the kind of Babylonian festival that they were surrounded by as they lived in exile in Babylon? And knowing that the Enuma Elish and the creation of the world, with Marduk defeating Tiamat, was so, informative and important to the Babylonian people, the priestly author writes a version of that story that highlights how their version of God, Elohim, is so much better. Marduk has to struggle and fight in a war and defeat Tiamat in battle. God just wills the universe into existence. There is no struggle. He creates a world that is ordered and good and beautiful and full of life, and is far different from the version that is created in Mesopotamian myth. To understand the first story of creation, you have to understand that it was written in this era, living in Babylon, as part of a reaction to Babylonian existence in their myths, trying to use those popular motifs to say, well, here's how we feel about the universe. This is what we think. Using motifs and ideas that already existed. Some more that came from various Mesopotamian ideas, creating man from earth and from breath. The two different versions. Well, really those two come from the later story in the garden. In the first story, it really doesn't say if God created him from man or from breath or from earth or what have you. In many different myths in this era at this time, God creates man from blood, from earth, from breath, or a combination of the three. Marduk at some points breathes into man to create him. In others, he cuts his head off, and from the blood comes man. Sometimes he kills another god called Kingu, and from Kingu's blood and clay, they make man. Often clay is involved. In Egypt, Kum uses the potter's wheel to shape man from earth, from clay. There's this really heavy, very ancient idea that the gods made us from dirt. And sometimes the idea that there's a spark of divine in us comes from the idea that a god shed their blood or their breath to create us. The version the Hebrew goes with is the breath, which I think makes a lot more sense given that they're not really trying to focus on like bloodthirstiness at this point. Now the idea of an ancient garden. There's a place in various different myths in Mesopotamian tradition that involves a garden of the gods. Dilmun is the name of one of them. Epic of Emerkar uses the place, the Dilmun, which is also described as a city as well as a garden. In the story of Enki and Nihursag, the two of them are husband and wife, and they live in the Garden of Dilmun, a place where there's no death, no illness, no one eats each other. Remember the ancient Hebrew myth says that everybody should be vegetarian. Well, so does this one. It says that the wolf does not eat the sheep, and you live in this garden without having to kill anything. There's also the cedar forest from Gilgamesh, which was a faraway forest that belonged to the gods. There was a special tree in that forest that was guarded by a giant named Kumbaba, which Gilgamesh goes on a journey to kill. Involved in the Enki and Ninhursag story is the goddess of the rib. In the story, Enki, it's a lot of drama, but basically Enki pisses off his wife, and she curses him with 8 illnesses in different parts of his body. Eventually, the fox and the other gods convince her to cure him because the world is dying without him, and so she goes to cure him and removes the illness. And every time she removes something, a goddess is born. When she removes his rib, she creates a woman from it whose name is Ninti. The name Ninti meant life and rib. She was the goddess of life, born from a rib. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? The food of immortality, which is mentioned in the Bible, the garden has the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Multiple myths in the past referenced foods that would make you immortal, especially the myth of Adapa, which was one of the 7 antediluvian sages. Babylon had this idea that there was like 7 sages sent to teach human civilization, and each of them fucked up somehow. Adapa was the son of the god Ea, who made a mistake, and he was summoned before the gods, and he was like, "Oh no, I'm afraid, Dad, what am I supposed to do?" And Ea says, "It's okay, it's cool, just be polite, be gentle, and if they offer you the food, don't eat it, because it's the food of death." And so he goes before the gods, and they have their whole thing, and they say, "Hey, thank you for being cool. Here is the food of life." And he refuses it, and they go, "Oh, well, that's weird. Why would you do that?" And he said, "My dad told me to." And they were like, "Oh, well, if you'd eaten it, you'd be immortal." And the story kind of just ends. And there's no real explanation for, like, why the food? Why was his father telling him not to eat the food? Did his father try to trick him? Was it a good thing? The stories back then often were left very vague because they were kind of like highlights, like notes. The stories were read aloud and performed, and the performers were meant to kind of give context, add their own flair, and so the stories weren't written down to like be read in full. They were just notes for performers to use when acting out the stories in public, where most people would have experienced them that way. So we don't really know the full scope of the story, but it's obvious that the idea of a food that gave immortality existed way before the Bible. In the myth of Inanna, she is killed in the underworld, and some gods are sent to sprinkle the food of life and the water of life over her, and she is resurrected. In Gilgamesh, he seeks out immortality, and he finds the plant of life. It's stolen from him by the serpent, and that's kind of an explanation for why serpents can shed their skin, blah, blah, blah. So what does it mean that all these stories existed before the Bible and clearly seem to be like the bricks that the author of these 2 stories, both of them, but especially the garden story, seem to be building off of? The motifs of the stories were well known. I mean, the stories that are being referenced in the Bible are thousands of years older than the Bible itself. So old that the written versions we've found, which are like 3,000 years old, were old at the time when they were written down. Like, those myths were even older than we can imagine. They'd been around forever. The authors knew that these things would be recognized. The myth of a garden, the food of immortality, all these things were known in that society. It's kind of like a modern person writing a story, trying to give their audience a certain message and using things we recognize so that we kind of get that message, There's tropes and themes that we would all recognize that these authors used because they knew that the people of their time would see them, know them, understand them, be cool with them. But they used them in new ways to make a point about their God as opposed to the myths that they came from. The God of the Bible, no one is his match. There's no one else in his pantheon. No one else is as powerful as him. He's omniscient, omnipotent, and benevolent, which gods of that era weren't always. He's a moral god, which again, not all these gods are. In the myth of Enki and Ninhursag, the story involves Enki having sex with his wife. She gives birth. He has sex with his daughter. She gives birth. He has sex with his granddaughter. She gives birth. Like, it involves a lot of immorality in their stories, which at various points in history, people would start to be, like, tired of the fact that, like, there was no answer to the world for them. They felt like there was no explanation, and also nothing moral in the gods that they were worshiping. Around the time of like the codes of Hammurabi, when people start writing down laws, concern for actually being a good person starts to rise. And so the desire for a god like this starts to rise. He creates the world and everything is good. Everything is good. The idea that they lived in a world that was a good place to be, also kind of revolutionary, that we're not living in a place that's broken or evil or full of vice. It's a good place. And we are good. We're stewards. It describes how we should be vegetarian, how we should take care of the world and be its steward. A very environmentally friendly message about respecting all life, which again is not something that appeared in every other story. Now, why did both stories get included here? Well, we know that the person who wrote the priest myth probably wrote it after the other story as a way of involving the people of the time in Babylonian tradition, of having their own version of the 7-day celebration of New Year's, and it's possible. Creating a myth that was less humanized, which the other myth, the older 10th century one about the garden, was heavily humanized. But even that garden myth is far different compared to other myths of the time. God creates man and creates this world and means for them to be good. This God is not, seducing his wife and having sex with his kid. Like, there's nothing immoral about this God. It's really kind of a sad story because there's Karen Armstrong writes a lovely book called In the Beginning that discusses the Genesis stories in detail, and how in the first story, creation comes from separation. We separate light and dark. They both exist now. It is good. In the second story, by separation, the seeds of the fall are created. God recognizes that Adam is lonely, and so he starts to try and create a helper for him. But God, now we see, is not enough. Adam's relationship with God is not enough. He is lonely. And God does not understand Adam. He thinks, I've got to create him someone to keep him company. And he doesn't understand Adam. He creates all these animals, and Adam's sitting there like, no. The term in Hebrew when he finally sees Eve kind of sounds like irritated, like, finally, you got it right. And in creating Eve and the fall that involves... Oh, thank you, Alexis. I got confused there for a second. I was like, what does this sound? The creation and the separation leads to them losing understanding of each other. They eat the apple, they see they're naked, they freak out, they lie, they complain and blame each other for it. They don't take responsibility. Separation is their downfall in the story. And you can see how both stories are important because they both represent different truths. God created the universe, and it's all beautiful and good and lovely. And yet, we live in a society where women are subjugated, and we are all struggling to survive, and it really is hard. Both things are true. Both creation stories represent facets of the life that these people knew. Now, are they real? The writer of the time would not have been concerned with whether or not this story was authentic, about whether it really happened. The last couple centuries of Western tradition has led us to an obsession with real truth. We had somebody arguing earlier that Moses wrote this and it's the literal truth that came from God. Like, no, that's not what they cared about. This was a spiritual truth. It was a psychological truth. It was meant to explain things and spiritual things about the inner world. A truth that wasn't meant to be taken at face value. It's not something that physically, literally happened in the world. It is something that represents spiritually the reality we live in. Sorry you've been harassed. I'm looking forward to your take on Bloober Team. Oh, don't worry. I'm still doing Silent Hill stuff. I just made a new Silent Hill video. I talked in a couple of videos last week about the Bloober Team thing. If you want to check out my previous stream on Devil May Cry, we talked about it. But no, I'm still making video game stuff. I just don't need your comments on those videos because people are ridiculous. Anyway, you can always join the Discord if you want to hang out. Karen Armstrong, in the beginning, has a lovely quote about why these stories existed. In all cultures, human beings have been fascinated by the mystery of existence. Their creation myths were not designed as factual accounts of the origin of life, but expressed their wonder that anything should exist at all. So what are the two stories trying to show? What is the point of both? The first account, what we call the priestly creation myth, shows that there's no conflict and struggle in the creation. God is completely omnipotent. There's no war, no upset. He just wills it into existence. It's an ordered place. There's a lawful idea at the center of the universe. And it's very alive. It's vital. It's be fruitful and multiply. Respect the world. There's this, focus on eat plants, not animals. Human beings are stewards, not owners of the world. Male and female are equal, created at the same time. They're exactly the same. He blesses creation, which the blessing is going to be a major factor in all the early Bible stories. Blessing has to do with fertility. Both of these stories really, but especially the first one, kind of reflects an idea of immortality that was new to the era. All those other immortal stories like Gilgamesh looking for immortality focused on the idea of trying to find a way for you yourself to live forever. These stories present immortality in the sense that be fruitful and multiply, have children, your community is immortal. Keep having children, keep the community together, take care of your fellow man, and that's how you live forever. A very new idea of immortality, but to the ancient people of Israel, that was how to be immortal. That was the eternal life that they're seeking in these mythic stories. The fact that we have been blessed with fertility, God has told us to be fruitful and multiply, that is what we'll do. He created a world full of life which we should respect and take care of, and immortality comes from the survival of our community and our lineage. Now, what does the second story try to show? It explains human society as it existed in the time, which would have been around the 10th century, around the time of the kings of Israel, Solomon and David and all. They live in a very deserted place. The only way they survive is when they have rain, they hope. It ends when God creates this garden, and in the end they're banished to the desert, which is where the people live now. They start equal and loving and at peace with each other. This idea of like a golden mythic age. All the old societies had this idea that once humankind lived in a perfect golden age alongside God, and then something happened. And in this case, that story explains how these people live in the desert, why their society is so unequal, why life is such a struggle. Later, Christians would interpret it and have far different, darker ideas of what it meant. At the time, that's not what the intended purpose was. It was part of a conviction that a lot of ancient societies had that life wasn't meant to be hard. Why is it hard? Including both myths shows the idea that God created everything good and all of us are equal. We're in God's image, we are made, and yet also we live in a society that's so flawed and so broken. Both things are true. God is all good, and yet there is struggle. The theme of separation and creation, the fact that it's good in one story and yet in another kind of shows that it can lead to loss. That by creating and separating from God, God eventually drifts away from Adam. The creation of the animals, in which he creates them without the divine breath, the way that he did Adam and Eve. How did God not know that that was not right? The idea that he just didn't understand his creation anymore because they were separate. A fascinating way of viewing the story in my mind. And Christians love to take it and say, the fall of man, humans are evil and blah, blah, blah. That's not really what it was intended for. That's not what it means. It means that, God is beautiful, God is lovely, the universe is lovely and such a good place, and yet we suffer. And yet we suffer. But at the end of the garden story, God clothes them before he sends them out into the desert. They're given protection, which the term used in the story for naked, it implies more like being defenseless. You aren't wearing any protection. And so the nakedness they recognize when they eat the fruit and they realize that they are capable of dying one day, the nakedness they recognize is their vulnerability. They realize they're vulnerable. The idea that what makes them lie to God and blame each other and become afraid is recognizing they can die, that they are vulnerable. And God sends them away because he realizes that the peace of the garden has broken. and now they have to leave and take care of themselves. I think it's a very sad story, but a very lovely one, and the idea, essentially it states that once everything was great, and it could have been different, but we messed up, but that's okay, because, life goes on. The idea that sin is so evil that came from later stories, this was more like, we messed up, but we're still here. God still loves us. We're going to make it. Very cool story. We will continue next time with Cain and Abel. Thank you all for joining me. Where is our Silent Hill stream? We will stream more Silent Hill at some point. I almost played 4 again over the weekend, but we got to finish DMC 3. We'll do that tomorrow. Probably do a reading as well. It's been a while since we've read a book, but that'll be on the second channel. Follow that. All these will be moving this week. I've just been busy and forgot to do it. So I will be moving eventually to all the other channel. Not sure if I subscribe to the idea that the world was good and gets worse. Yeah, it's not like I necessarily believe that, but the ancient world, multiple ancient societies saw that as true. The idea that, things around them really sucked, and so part of their, dealing with it was, oh, well, once it was good, Telling those kind of stories kind of gives you, I guess, hope that it could be good again. I'm in agreement with Tanya. God is a poor business model. Well, he did his best. Are we talking about God or are we talking about Elohim? There's 2 gods in this story. Again, more the reason why we think that there were multiple authors, because the God of these stories changes so much. One author points out that the first Genesis, the God that's so omnipotent and benevolent and peaceful, kind of vanishes from the rest of the ancient stories. The God that we see in the other pieces of the Bible is far more like the anthropomorphized God of the garden, probably because the first Genesis story was written centuries after those earlier stories that we're going to go into eventually. Thanks for listening. I will be here next weekend with something. Every Sunday we'll do some kind of religious-related discussion. Don't know what next week will be. We may alternate the Bible stuff, so we'll see. More about Phil Collins? Phil Collins? What? The singer? I'm confused. So tomorrow we'll do video game, probably a book as well, if I have time. The books are out. The Bayonetta books have arrived, so tomorrow they should all be mailed out if you ordered a physical copy. If you want to check out my books, links in the description. Silent Hill books, Bayonetta one's out. I hope to do one on Devil May Cry eventually. If you like what I do and you want to support it, become a member. You get access to extra content and copies of my digital books for free. Lots of stuff, and it really helps me out. You can join through Patreon or through YouTube, and you get access to all the Silent Hill symbolism videos, because now some of those are locked. If you can't support monetarily, but you still want to hang out with the community and get access to some extra stuff, join the Discord. That's a way to do it if you can't do so financially. Thanks again, and I will see you all next time. Bye.